Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Make 2020 the Year of Your Nonprofit's Marketing Revolution. My name is Christina Goggery-Campbell, and I'm the Director of Strategic Communications and Public Relations at Independent Sector. We're a diverse community of nonprofits, foundations, and corporate giving programs working to ensure all people in the United States thrive. This webinar is brought to you by Independent Sector and Prosper Strategies, the leading marketing and communications consultancy for the nonprofit sector. And I'm here today with Alyssa Conrardy, President and co-founder of Prosper Strategies, and Steve Majors, Vice President of Branding and Communications at Communities and Schools. Hello, Alyssa and Steve.
Hi there. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Hello, everyone.
Many of you have joined us for earlier webinars on Prosper Strategies' Nonprofit Marketing Manifesto series. If that's you, welcome back. And if you're new, we are happy you're here. Our previous webinars covered the 10 commitments in the Nonprofit Marketing Manifesto. Last month, we discussed how to bake them into your culture. Today, we're going to wrap up this series with a bang and talk about how to use what you've learned over the last year to make 2020 the year of your nonprofit's marketing revolution. We're excited to have Steve here to join us for this discussion. He's been leading marketing and communications revolution over the last few years at his organization, Communities and Schools. As always, don't worry about taking notes. We'll send out the recording and slides after today's session. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Alyssa.
Okay, thanks so much, Christina, and welcome, everyone. See that there's still some folks trickling into the room. We're really excited to be here with you again today, and thanks so much, Steve, for joining us as our guest. Before we dive into our content today, I'd like to take just a moment to help you orient yourselves with GoToWebinar, as we usually do, and greet some of you on the line. So if you could, please go ahead and find the questions box and share with us your name, your organization name, your title or what you do, and where you're joining from. I'll wait for those to come in, and then I'll welcome a few of you. Just so you know, you can use today's questions box that's on the sidebar in your webinar to ask questions of myself and of Steve. I'll keep an eye on those questions throughout today's webinar, and we'll answer as many of them as we can at the conclusion of today's session. Hopefully we'll be able to get to all of them. And as Christina said, don't worry, you will get a recording of this webinar and the deck after today's session. So welcome to some of you who are finding the questions box. Looks like you're finding it okay. So we have Joanne joining from Toledo, Ohio, from the Greater Toledo Community Foundation, Director of Marketing and Communications. Trina joining from Colorado Springs, Council of Neighbors and Organizations, Marketing Manager. We have Liza Holland from Paso Fino Horse Association in Lexington. Hannah from the Scott County Family Justice Center. Robin from Wildwood Outdoor Education Center in Kansas City. Welcome to all of you, and to the names that I haven't read off, don't worry, I'm still seeing you come through. Just want to keep us moving. So don't forget to use that questions box throughout today's webinar. You met Christina just a moment ago, and thank you, Christina, for kicking us off. For those of you who don't yet know me, just by way of quick introduction, I'm Alyssa Conrardy, the co-founder and president of Prosper Strategies. We're a Chicago-based marketing firm that works exclusively with nonprofits like Boys and Girls Clubs, the McCormick Foundation, Illinois Environmental Council, Volunteers of America, and many, many more on marketing and brand strategy. And through that work, we've had a lot of experience helping organizations go from being sort of ambivalent about marketing to really fully realizing its potential for mission impact. So I'm really excited for this discussion today, where we're going to share a few ideas on how to do just that as we enter into the new year. And Steve, since this might be the first time that many in our audience are meeting you, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself as well?
Well, sure. Again, I'm Steve Majors. I'm the Vice President of Branding and Communications here at Communities and Schools. I've been here in this role for about 5 years. For those who are maybe unfamiliar with Communities and Schools, we're a national education nonprofit. We work inside schools supporting at-risk kids with the resources that they need to stay in school, graduate, and go on to success in life. We operate in 26 states in the District of Columbia.
Thanks so much, Steve. And if you've been following along with this series all year, attendees, you know that most of our webinars this year have been devoted to unpacking one of the 10 commitments in our nonprofit marketing manifesto. If you're not familiar or just need a refresher, maybe you haven't been on in a while, these are the commitments that we feel nonprofit organizations must make in order to see through the full potential of marketing and communications in service of their missions. So if you don't already have a copy of the manifesto, you can grab it via the link in the chat box, which is different from the questions box. You'll find that on the sidebar of GoToWebinar, and I'll be referencing it a whole bunch. Last month, we had made it all the way through the commitments by the time we got to last month's webinar, so we turned our focus in November to synthesizing those 10 commitments and really making them part of your organization's culture. And now, believe it or not, with the new year, a new decade almost upon us, feels like it snuck up, we want to close out the series by really discussing how you can take everything you've learned over the course of this year and the series and use it to make 2020 your organization's best year ever when it comes to marketing and communications. Really, as the title of this webinar says, the year of your nonprofit's marketing revolution. So to make the manifesto as actionable for you as possible as we go into the new year, I wanted to start today's webinar by sharing our ideas of 5 New Year's resolutions that you can make based on everything you learned from this webinar series over the course of this year. And then we'll turn to Q&A with Steve to make this more tangible. Steve has spent the last few years really creating and fostering a marketing revolution at communities and schools, so he can tell us how some of these ideas in the manifesto and that I'm sharing with the 5 New Year's resolutions can actually come into reality. So the first resolution I'd like to encourage you to make as you enter 2020 is to distribute the Nonprofit Marketing Manifesto organization-wide at your nonprofit. And I'm willing to bet that so far, if you've been engaging with the manifesto throughout the year, you've probably kept it to yourself or within your marketing communications department, or maybe at best you've shared it with your CEO or your board. But now that you've learned all the concepts within the manifesto, or you will if you go back and watch all the webinars from this year if you haven't already, I think it's really time to make this new mindset about marketing known organization-wide. So that's the first thing I would encourage you to do. And you can do that just by distributing the full manifesto, which again is linked in the chat, or on the left side of your screen, you're seeing here, we've also created this handy poster that summarizes all of the commitments from the manifesto into one page. This is something that can be posted in your break room, for instance, or given to every employee and posted up at their desks. You can distribute it through your internal communications channels, email it around. As I said before, seeing through the full potential of marketing for your mission starts with a mindset shift. So this resolution of really embedding the ideas from the manifesto throughout your whole organization is critical. And the second resolution I'd like to propose you make is to create a written 2020 marketing plan and share it, or at least the highlights of that plan organization-wide. We've covered this a lot during the course of the series. We've talked about the many reasons that a written plan is important, but what it really comes down to is just this. A plan gives you focus on using marketing to advance your mission. It gives you really the power to prioritize the activities that matter for mission advancement and the freedom to turn down requests that don't, because they don't fit with the plan, they don't advance your strategy, and therefore you can be more impactful. So if you need some guidance on this, our Essential Nonprofit Marketing Plan template can help. This resource typically costs $99, but we'll give it to you half off through tomorrow. As soon as this webinar ends, the code 2020 will be active at checkout. You can find the link to this in your chat box. I'll also send it around following today's webinar. There's also a ton of free resources on our website. If you just search within our blog, Marketing Plan, you'll find a ton of free resources about how to develop a marketing plan aligned with your strategic plan that will advance your goals and keep you focused. And the third resolution I'd like to suggest that you commit to in 2020 is really prioritizing asset-based communication. We talked about what asset-based communication means and why it's so important to nonprofit communications during our September webinar with Dory McWhorter of YWCA Chicago. And if you weren't on that webinar or you're not familiar with the topic, most of you are, I think, asset-based communication can be defined at its most basic level as the process of communicating about our stakeholders and the communities that our organizations serve in a way that recognizes them as whole people, as whole communities, rather than focusing on their deficits and needs. And it's so critical that the nonprofit sector lead the way in this respect in assets-based communication. And the most of us are trying, I think, at our organizations, from the conversations I'm having at least. Many of us also have a long way to go. You could use some extra help in this department. A couple of resources I'd suggest. The first is the Progressive Style Guide, which has preferred language for a variety of different communities, from the LGBTQ+ community to those living with disabilities. And then the Frameworks Institute. You've heard me talk about this on past webinars. Frameworks Institute has studied how people respond to communication choices in a variety of different issue areas. So education is one example, environment, climate change. How can we talk about these issues in a way that's going to be most resonant with people who need to be part of the conversation? And then after learning from resources like these, and there's many more, I'd suggest developing your own guide to assets-based communication, like this example you're seeing at the bottom of your screen from Step Up. They've defined what an assets-based approach means in Step Up's world based on the people and communities that they work with. And I feel that in 2020, every organization should have its own assets-based style guide like this. So again, links to all three of these in the chat box. Next up, the fourth resolution I'd suggest you make in 2020 is to find a way to make true marketing and communications investments. As we discussed back on our July webinar with Kevin Radelet of Leukemia Research Foundation and Tabitha Upshaw of Global Wildlife Conservation, a marketing budget isn't just a nice to have. It's really, truly essential to your nonprofit's ability to drive all its goals forward. And most nonprofits need to spend about the same proportion of their overall budgets on marketing as for-profits do. So saying because we're a nonprofit, we don't need to have a sizable marketing budget, that can't fly in 2020 and in the future. You need marketing just as much as the for-profit sector. So if you need help setting up a true marketing budget and advocating for support of that budget from your leadership team or from your board this year, make sure you download our nonprofit marketing budgeting how-to guide, again, linked in the chat box, as is everything else. You're seeing a trend here, which can really help start the conversation about what your budget should look like, benchmarks from other similar organizations, and rewatch that webinar or watch it for the first time if you haven't already about setting a marketing budget. I think there's a lot of valuable resources there. And last but not least, I'd like to propose that you make a resolution to work not just in marketing, but on marketing in 2020. As many of you probably know from past webinars, we organized what we called a marketing mastermind this year. It was a small group of about 12 or 15 nonprofit marketers that I worked with every single month throughout 2019 in a group to help them see through and pursue the commitments in the manifesto at their own organizations. And at our last meeting, really throughout the whole time, but especially at our last meeting, one theme that really came out of the mastermind is this feeling among participants that the ideas in the manifesto are all really important, critical even to your nonprofit success, but they're really hard to find time to drive forward when you're sort of stuck in the weeds of day-to-day work in nonprofit marketing and communications. We're all busy, we all have a lot to do, we're all fielding requests from all different directions, from C-suite to programs to the board. I know that so many of you on today's webinar can probably relate. You probably are kind of constantly just trying to keep your head above water throughout different times of the year and feeling like, well, it'd be nice to focus on the bigger picture, but I just don't have the time. So in 2020, I'd like you to commit to carving out a little time each week or at bare minimum each month to work on marketing and not in marketing. If you can get away with it, and I bet most of you can, try blocking off at least one day a month where you don't take meetings. And make this your big picture thinking day where you only work on things like strategy, culture change, and driving forward and the commitments within the manifesto, not just responding to incoming requests. I think you'll be really amazed at the difference that blocking that time off and committing to big picture thinking makes. If you need more advice here, and I think we probably all do, a fantastic book that I'd like to recommend is Deep Work by Cal Newport. And the subtitle, Rules for Focused Success in a Distracted World, really says it all. That really spoke to me. I hope it does to you too. I think we'll find a lot of ideas here and may just need to experiment with some of your own. But if you can carve out some time for deep work, for big picture thinking, it'll make a huge difference in 2020 and beyond. So those are the 5 resolutions that I'd suggest. You likely have many more of your own in mind, and I'd love to hear them. So feel free to pop them into the questions box, and I'll try to read off a few as we get to the end of today's webinar. But before we go there, I'd like to transition to talking about what starting a marketing revolution looks like in the real world with someone who's done it, as I said, Steve. So Steve, let's go ahead and jump into the Q&A portion of today's webinar.
Great.
All right, so I'd like to start at the beginning, right? At least the beginning of your time at Communities and Schools, and would love to hear from you what the organization's marketing and communications function looked like when you joined back in 2013.
Yeah, great question. Before I even jump into that question, just real briefly, I will have to say, as I look at all the resources and assets and all the professional development and peer-to-peer learning that you all have been doing over the course of this year, I'm just struck by the fact of how much of this would have been useful to me earlier in my career. I think, like some of you on the call, some of the lessons had to be picked up along the way. There weren't organizations, there wasn't an intentional effort to kind of provide support among nonprofit communicators to provide these resources and this information sharing. And so I'm just so gratified to see that you all are doing this kind of work, because I think it's so important. And so I'd encourage everybody who's on the call or joining the webinar today to really take advantage of those, because they just don't exist out there in other places. And seeing that they now exist kind of all in one place is gratifying to me, because I think the road will be a lot easier than it was for at least for me.
Thanks so much.
When I think about, no problem. So when I think about the function where we were back in 2013 compared to where we are today, this idea of function, it was a function, and it was, but it was nascent. Back in 2013, 2014, the organization has been around for close to 40 years and really had not given much thought, time, and investments or resources to communications and marketing. They had spent some money sort of in drips and drabs here and there, but when I joined, the board had finally realized that they had to do some with some intentionality and make sure that it was sustainable. And when I joined, communications was seen as a function. I think the mindset in-house was that, those are the folks that we go to for some specific functions. So we go to them if we need something written. We go to them if we need something proofread. We go to them if we need something designed. We go to them if we need a question answered. But it really wasn't integrated into the organization, much like it is today, and much like I see, like you're advocating in the manifesto. Practically what that meant is that the team was very small. There was a head of communications who actually was not me. I came in as a number 2, and there were a couple of individuals, basically 2.5 bodies. One was devoted to digital, and another was devoted to PR, and that half body served as sort of an admin assistant and sort of as a gopher for the rest of the team. And so how that played out in execution, even then, back in 2013, is we realized very quickly that we had to change the mindset of the organization and make sure that they understood that this was something that was, although we were kind of an agency for the organization, that we were there to really be a part of everything strategic that was happening within the organization. We were not isolated from all the other work that was going on, that we needed sustainable funding, that we needed to make sure that people understood that we were, and I love this from the 10 commitments because it's very true, the real role of marketing as a tool for driving social change.
Absolutely. Yeah, and where you started, Steve, when you came in, I think probably sounds pretty familiar to many people on today's webinar. That is where most organizations are when we start working with them, where marketing is a function, where marketing is sort of an order taker. And even if it's respected from that perspective, it's not integrated strategically. So to hear that you were able to evolve it in such a way where now you truly are that strategic driver of mission, hopefully gives a lot of folks on today's webinar some hope that it can be done.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about why you were brought on to, although maybe this wasn't said in your job description, I doubt it at least, to start a marketing revolution at communities and schools. What was the motivation for sort of bringing you in, and I guess just in general, kind of transforming the function?
Sure. Well, again, I'll just repeat, the organization had been around for 40 years, and I think our board, a lot of the work of the organization was just on capacity building. How can we serve more kids? How can we do the work more efficiently, effectively? How can we raise more funds? And I think the board at the time had an aha moment that understood that marketing was, integral in order to make that happening, and that it wasn't just about buying advertising or creating specific assets or writing press releases, but that really this was an important way to kind of achieve those goals. And so I would say there was a culture change. I think I was brought on to help sort of initiate a culture change within the organization. Just a little bit of background. So we're a national organization of about 75 folks, but we are a federated network. So we have affiliates, chapters in 26 states that basically serve, that are, what that looks like is about 135 of those across the country in 26 states and DC. They each are their own nonprofits, and so each with varying levels of marketing expertise. And so, in effect, what we were doing is we were creating this marketing mindset, not only for us as a national office, but also for all of our affiliates. And there was a realization, I believe, at that time that we couldn't just do this work at the national level, that we had to really energize all of our affiliates to row in the same direction. And that was going to really take sort of a revolutionary approach to what we thought of as marketing and what they thought of as marketing. The goals early on, and I know we're going to get into this in a future question, I think the board at that time thought, well, great, we're going to be famous, and that will solve all of our problems. That if we just can get just enough marketing to be famous, we'll raise enough money, we will achieve all our policy goals. And I think very early on we had to really work towards changing their expectations of what marketing could, would, and should do.
Absolutely. And was there kind of a key voice on the board that was driving that desire to be famous? Was that something that was sort of shared in the culture of the entire board, or where did that come from?
Yep. I think, again, there were a couple of voices on our board, who had some expertise. And again, I don't fault them for that thought, but I think what we had to help them understand is that we could be famous, but towards what end?
Right.
And so this idea of aligning marketing with the strategic goals, that being famous didn't necessarily mean we were going to achieve our strategic goals. And I joined just as a marketing campaign was launching, and within a year it was fairly clear that we hadn't become more famous and we hadn't achieved any of our strategic goals.
Right.
And so that really actually required us, as I look at this slide now, to readjust and launch what is our current campaign, which is the All In for Kids campaign, and which required us actually to step back in terms of, as I look at your 10 commitments about brand, image, and identity in alignment with mission and values. We had to pause on the marketing and start with some foundational brand work.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's so common. Everyone, I shouldn't say everyone, but in most cases, most organizations we work with, people are excited to jump ahead to execution, to seeing marketing come to life across all of the various different channels that we might want to use. But until the brand is built and is clear, and there's been some work done just to strengthen the identity of the organization, campaigns like the one that you came in at the kind of beginning of are not going to be effective. So
Absolutely.
let's dig into that a little bit more. So you said the board wanted to be famous. I think the other words you used when you and I talked about this are they wanted to be the most well-known nonprofit in America. Nice aspiration. So tell us more about just tangibly what steps you took to determine if that was the right goal. You might have had a gut feeling that it wasn't, but to determine whether that was the right goal to have in mind and to set the organization on the right path.
Sure. So once we launched that initial campaign, we went out every year to do some, well, on the year anniversary of it, we went out to do some brand strength survey work. So awareness of our brand, or at least awareness of our organization. And in spite of a really significant investment of money in that marketing campaign, we discovered, in spite of all those efforts, we were not the most well-known nonprofit in America. And in fact, we were no more well-known than we were when we started. Mm-hmm. And so that was, again, I think, coming in, I think, many of us understood that that was not necessarily the right goal. And so sort of setting us on the right path really involved us doing a real sort of debrief or an audit of that first campaign to say, where did we go wrong? One of the first things was that we discovered is, we launched that campaign in all 50 states, in spite of the fact that we only operated in 26 states in the District of Columbia. So there was investment in money, and I'm a true believer that no matter how much national work that you're doing, people's experience of a brand has to have something tangible in where they live. Mm-hmm. And so, people's experience of Starbucks is both from, what they see in any national advertising, even though I don't even know how much advertising Starbucks does even nationally anymore, but it's their experience of the brand is the experience that they have in their neighborhood coffee shop. And the same is true generally of a nonprofit. So if we're not working in North Dakota, why do we even want to be well known in North Dakota at this time?
Right. Yeah. And if it's just a pride thing, and it doesn't serve mission, and particularly if it's not even impacting mission, something has to give, right? Something has to change.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay, fascinating. So I'm sure you faced some challenges in the process of kind of righting the ship here. Pull back the curtain if you would, and tell us about what was difficult in this process of transforming marketing and communications, especially after that failed campaign or difficult campaign at communities and schools.
Sure. So it was aligning our board, our national staff, and our network, and really helping educate them. And so, the manifesto that you encouraged folks to share with their organizations in the new year, I think that's important because there should be an alignment about what marketing is, what it can accomplish. And so that was a very real challenge. I think that there was a little loss of faith from our network after that first campaign, because they said, I don't think they particularly liked it, and they saw that it wasn't effective. They felt like it was something that was done just to kind of burnish the national image, and it wasn't helping them in their own communities for their own strategic goals. They didn't see themselves in it. They didn't see the value in it. They didn't see the benefits from it. And so that challenge really was in changing the culture or changing the mindset of our national office staff and our network about what marketing and communications were. And that involved a lot of legwork. It involved a lot of inclusion. It involved us admitting where we had gone wrong on that first campaign, pulling back the curtain, explaining where the strategic mistakes were, asking people for their feedback, honest and candid, asking them to be partners in the work that moved ahead, and beginning with research and brand work so that folks felt the decisions that we were going to make in the future were grounded in some factual basis. This is what the research tells us, and we have included your voice, and we have allowed you to have input. And that gave them a greater level of confidence in the decisions that we decided to make after that first campaign.
Absolutely. I love that you mentioned inclusion. That is one of the kind of hallmark tenets of our work at Prosper Strategies, is that decisions can only be made if they include both the people who our organizations aim to help and to serve and the people who are involved in carrying out that work. We can't sit in our marketing and communications bubbles and know whether the decisions we're making are in tune with those people unless we ask them for their opinions. And we really go into both our staff, our program staff, and the communities that we aim to help and include them in the process. I think even if the campaign had been effective, it may not have been perceived as such without that inclusion element. So bringing that into the mix as you aim to kind of rebuild trust and bring people along with this next phase of marketing transformation is so important.
Absolutely.
So tell us more about how you got buy-in from, we've talked about your board a little bit already, so maybe we start with them, your board and your leadership team and other stakeholders as you did this work. There was a lot of inclusion, a lot of trust building, but what else did you do to kind of involve them in the process and get them to come along?
Yes. So we readily shared the results of that first research, or the first brand awareness research. So we were completely transparent. So when those first research results came back and showed that the campaign had not moved brand awareness, we were absolutely transparent with folks and shared that with them. And so I think that gave our leadership team, our board, and other stakeholders some confidence that that they could trust us, that we were going to have integrity in this process, that there weren't things that we were going to be hiding from them, and that we wanted them as partners. I think the next thing that we did is we did some internal survey of them about what they thought about marketing and communications, what their benefits were, and where the gaps lie, and how they were or were not being served. Another key thing that we did is we began to kind of draw sort of guardrails about what we were doing as a team and what we were not doing. Things as simple as, every time that somebody wrote an email or a letter, they were coming to the marketing and communications team and expecting us to proofread it. And I made very clear, I said, we could spend all of our time basically being, I would hope in an organization that there are other folks who are writers, and there are tools out there. We're happy to have eyeballs on things, but we cannot spend all of our time writing for you and proofreading.
Right.
We were clear about that our work in the next couple of years, in the first couple of years, was going to be more externally focused. So there were a lot of internal publications that we were then responsible for, and we took those off of our plate and said, we're not going to be responsible for that. Mm-hmm. And I think the last thing that we did is when we did the research, we sort of created that first marketing plan was very aspirational. Mm-hmm. And so we looked at things that we knew that we wanted to achieve, and we put that in that marketing plan, what those aspirations were. Things as, some of them were silly, things like we would like to have an op-ed in the New York Times. Now, clearly these were tactics, mm-hmm. but we put some of those things in to show them what we wanted to achieve. I'm happy to say many of those things we did end up achieving. And so allowing the leadership, the board, and other stakeholders see what our aspirations were and bringing them in on that process really created some excitement about the work.
That's so awesome. I am just applauding silently to everything you're saying over here. I want to go back to two things. The first is talking about sharing all of the data on the first campaign. I think marketing is sort of a weird aspect of many organizations, in that we hold ourselves to the standard often as marketers or marketing departments that in order to be seen as legitimate within our organizations, nothing that we do can ever fail. And almost no one else within our organizations is held to that same standard or is holding themselves to that same standard, no other department or function of the organization. I don't know why we do that in marketing. Maybe it's because we've had to struggle for so long to get sort of a foothold as legitimate, to get budget, that sort of thing. But like any other function of an organization, you are going to try things that don't work. And I think being able and willing to experiment and then share openly when campaigns or other efforts do fail is so critical. So I want to encourage everyone to take some risks, to be willing to fail. Hopefully you don't, but when you do, to share that, to learn from that, just like Steve and his team did at Communities and Schools. And then I also just love what you said about putting guardrails around the work. That's one of the reasons that I so encourage having a marketing and communications plan, because it really allows you to put those guardrails in writing and say, this is what marketing and communications owns, this is what we don't own, and there is a mission-backed reason for those guardrails, right? So sometimes that can be done without a plan, and maybe that was the case at Communities and Schools, but if you're having trouble setting those parameters or putting those guardrails in place, I think a marketing and communications plan can really help.
I will also say it does require, again, making sure specifically at the highest level that you have buy-in from leadership. And so, what is not appreciated, again, is, as a marketing leader, you telling, we're not going to do this work, boss, or we need this amount of money. So I really felt we had the trust and the confidence of our leadership as we embarked on that. And so I would really encourage all the folks joining today to really think about that and to really make sure that you have a partner in your leadership and folks who understand and are willing sometimes to both allow you to fail and allow you to take risks and allow you to hold true to those guardrails when others in the organization push against them.
So critical. I completely agree. I think if you walk away from this webinar with one thing in mind, let it be that. So let's dig in, Steve, more. I'm sure folks are curious to know into what the campaign that did not succeed looked like, and then what the campaign that you've launched since looks like and how it has really played out over the last few years at Communities and Schools. I have some screenshots I can show of what the campaign looks like that I can kind of put up as you talk here.
Sure. So, and again, I'm just so glad that very early on that you talked about sort of asset-based communication. Our first campaign, which I'm fortunate enough, you're not going to see any examples of it in these slides. I'm not that particularly proud of it, really was deficit-based. And so this is a problem that many nonprofits get in, specifically those who work in human services. So forlorn faces of people, staring, off into the distance in cameras and really communicating about the problems, the dire need, the huge hurdles, the problems, the statistics. And there are two problems with that. One is I feel like it doesn't work. I feel like there was a time and place for that, probably in marketing years ago. It's become sort of ubiquitous in some sectors. People still do that, and it's hard to stand out and be unique. And I think sort of, research has shown that people's tastes and their willingness or their openness for that kind of messaging doesn't exist anymore. Those sort of scare tactics and gloom and doom sort of things. I think there sometimes is a place for that, but by and large, if you center an entire campaign around it, or even your entire identity, I feel like you are setting yourself up for failure. So that's what that first campaign looked like. What the research told us is that a couple of things, when we went out and did both qualitative research and quantitative research, surveys and focus groups, that when people understood our work, they wanted to see positive, empowering, inspiring stories about real people, real individuals. They wanted to feel a connection between this idea of relationship, specifically because of our work is really, I'm not saying this would work for everyone, but this idea of relationship between the kids who serve our students and our students really resonated with folks. And this idea that we were in schools. So you'll see the hashtag all in for schools, or in some of the assets, you'll see this idea of in schools, because that is a differentiator for us as a program. We're not an after school program. We're not a before school program. We are in schools all day, every day, and we help kids. And the idea is we help them stay in school. And so the research showed us that, and you'll see it reflected here, the positive affect of the students and our site coordinators, how they are placed in relationship with each other, the backdrop, the photography, placing them inside school buildings was really key. And so once we landed on this, what you're seeing on this slide here is we understood the need to kind of surround folks with that. We have a very, very, very modest advertising budget. We don't spend a lot of money. But what we understood, this idea of opportunistic media, we do have an agency that negotiates placement for PSAs, and we have partnered with them over the years to really think strategically about how can we get this message in front of as many eyeballs as possible, but in key markets. And so, for example, you'll see in that first, right in the middle, you'll see that is a jumbo screen in New York City. We don't operate in New York City. Having said that, it makes all the sense in the world for us to be present, the largest media market in the world, to get in front of many eyeballs as possible, and our agency was able to negotiate that free placement. Now, that's not up 52 weeks of the year, but it was up 7 to 10 days during the holiday season. And so those sorts of decisions about, if you ever stumble upon our advertising, you'll see us in a lot of airports. Sometimes you'll see us in taxi cabs, in elevators, in malls. You'll see us at some point we were on, streaming on Hulu. So there were opportunities for us to really, once we landed on the brand and then the execution of the brand, how to make some strategic decisions about where we advertised.
Yeah, that's awesome. You certainly don't look like an organization that has a tiny marketing budget, and I hope that that's inspiring to others to see just how much you can do when you get creative with PSAs and other sorts of kind of economical placements. I think there's a credibility element here, and I think there's also just that surround sound element that Steve talked about of touch points everywhere. You're at the airport, you're in the taxi, you're watching something on Hulu, you're waiting for the bus, and there's an ad in the transit station. And yeah, maybe they're not there all year round in all these places at all the same times. People are seeing you and seeing that repetition enough, and the messaging and the brand is strong enough, most importantly, that it begins to sink in, it begins to work. It's really awesome.
Yep. And I'd just like to add two additional things. Two things that I think are important for the audience. One is, again, I'm going back to your commitments. How is it going to be measurable? Like what we told our ad placement agency is we need to measure either impressions, we need to measure sort of digital engagement. What we wanted to be able to go back to the board and say, again, we'd hope that awareness would move, but we also wanted to say, here was our investment, and here's what we achieved. Now, gratefully, awareness did move in the time that we've launched this campaign, but in the event that it didn't, or that it stalled, we needed to be able to measure the impact of it. And the
Absolutely.
other thing that I would say, again, I wouldn't expect that everybody on this call has a need to, have advertising in New York City. There may be folks on this call that have no advertising budget, but the strategy of figuring out where are your audiences, how can I reach them and how can I provide touch points? This idea, where do I, how can I find unique and creative ways to reach them, sometimes in non-traditional ways, and it does not always include sort of the traditional ideas of, okay, but I don't have a money for a physical ad. Where can I take this messaging, this creative collateral, and how and where can I reach them?
Right. And how can we empower people who already support us to do some of that work for us, right? Make our messaging shareable, make it engaging on social media so that our existing donors and supporters and volunteers and even possibly program participants feel compelled to share with their networks.
Absolutely.
That's great. Okay. So you talked a little bit about results. Tell us more about the sorts of results you've seen from the campaign over the last few years and from marketing overall since you started at Communities and Schools.
Yep. So again, at that first sort of brand awareness survey, after the first campaign, it was null. And so we spent work, again, we went back. Before we launched a brand new campaign, we just let it sit out there. And we went back and we did research, we did brand work, and then we began creative, and we tested the creative this time. Believe it or not, the first time that we went out in that first campaign, there was no testing of the creative. So this time, we went out, and before the campaign launch, we tested the creative with small focus groups. That doesn't require professional focus groups if you don't have a budget for that. It could be folks in your community. It could be folks on your board. It could be your funders. It could be your consumers. Ask them, does this speak to you? Does this resonate with you? Does this make you want to take action?
Yeah.
And in the time since then, the results were gratified to say that in the next campaign after the first wave, we saw a marked increase in brand awareness. People who, when prompted and unprompted, were able to recognize our name, our logo, our messaging line, our creative, and who were able to tie it back to key themes that we wanted attributed to us. And we tested, and we still do test, their willingness to take action, to donate, to advocate for us, to volunteer, and to engage with us on social media. And I will tell you that there's another shift that is actually going on in our organization, and I see in other organizations. In the coming year, we will continue to measure brand awareness, but we are putting a higher priority on moving brand engagement.
Yes.
Because I go back to our first issue, our first problem. Yes, we are more quote unquote famous, but if they are not more willing to take action and to help us achieve our strategic goals, to raise money, to change policies, to spread the word about the work that we do, then we are not, it's not strategic. And so we are putting more of an emphasis on moving brand engagement than we are on brand awareness.
I just am so refreshed to hear that. Not only is it not strategic, but if you're not driving willingness to engage, what is the point, really? That is the entire reason our organizations exist, to drive engagement in the service of our missions. Being famous might make us feel warm and fuzzy for a few minutes, but it isn't going to help more kids benefit from the mission that Communities and Schools exist to address.
Yep. And I'm gratified to say that, again, let's just take fundraising. I will just say this. In that first campaign, our fundraising folks weren't partners with us in this work. We brought them on board very early on because no matter whether or not a billboard was, if a billboard is out in the woods and nobody's there to see it, does anybody care? We wanted to make sure that the physical assets, the creative that we were using, was helpful to them in their direct mail, in their email fundraising, in their prospecting packets. And so as they went out and did retail advertising, face-to-face meetings with donors, with people who could give money, or retail advertising in terms of reaching out to consumers in our database, we wanted to make sure that could we measure whether or not, and we see, I don't know if it's a causation, but we do see a correlation. Our fundraising has increased since our brand awareness and brand engagement has increased. So we feel confident that it's working.
So awesome. And yeah, it's often really difficult to prove that causation, but I'm almost certain that there is at least some impact when you're driving that sort of awareness and engagement shift. Definitely encourage everyone on the line, if you're thinking about launching a campaign, whether it's large scale like this one or really small scale, to think about, one, how you can get more mileage outside of marketing for fundraising, development, other areas of your organization, and two, just how you can engage and partner with those folks and make sure that you are working from the same general strategy and set of goals. Great. Okay, last question, and then we'll transition to audience questions. What's the number one piece of advice, Steve, that you would give other nonprofit communications and marketing professionals who are feeling fired up based on this discussion and they want to start their own marketing revolution in 2020 and beyond?
Yep. I would say a plan. It is a process. It will all not. It will all. You cannot achieve it all in a month or even a year. But take the first step. You have a roadmap, a wonderful roadmap provided right here by the folks at Prosper Strategies. You have ideas, you have blueprints, you have guidelines, you have a manifesto. Just understand it's going to be a process, but take the first step. And those steps in terms of the resolutions that you all began this webinar, are laid out for you. And so understand the time will go by faster than you can imagine, and you're going to achieve things that you didn't think were even possible, but don't be overwhelmed by the scope and scale of it. Take the first step, look and take the next step after that, look at what's right in front of you, and tick those small things off. Those small wins and small steps are going to snowball into major achievements. There will be some setbacks along the way, but if you stick to it, you will achieve your goals.
Yes, oh, that's great. Put one foot in front of the other. Don't get too caught up on how overwhelming the big picture might be. Of course, have that goal, but then just start and keep putting one foot in front of the other. It's great. Okay, well, audience, if you want to relocate that questions box where we started, would love to take a few questions from the audience here. We'll get to as many as we can in our last few minutes. Oh, great. Here's one from Megan. Megan asked if, Steve, if you can talk a little bit more about the PSA work, and for a smaller nonprofit that doesn't have the budget maybe to work with an agency, any tips for securing PSA type placements?
Yep. To make the ask. The agency that we work with, again, they encourage our own nonprofits and they train them how to just make the ask. And so sometimes it's as simple as calling your local billboard company. Sometimes the numbers are right on the bottom of a billboard, and asking, asking like, do you have times of the year when you donate space? Calling your local newspaper, calling the radio station and asking for the community engagement manager. The same for the television station. Finding, just make the ask. Don't worry about the proper language. Oftentimes, some media outlets, some billboard and outdoor companies, they will help you even sometimes do the creative, if not just make sure it's sized appropriately. Yep. But explain the mission, explain what it is that you want to achieve, admit that you might not be using the right language, but they'll get it. Don't be afraid to make the ask.
Yeah, I agree. And I'll just add to that many radio and TV stations, at least, have requirements to donate a certain amount of ad space every year. So you're not asking for something that will sound totally foreign or unrealistic to them. They're used to these sorts of requests. they need to meet certain requirements, and a lot are happy to work with new organizations and causes. And on that note, Steve, Stacy asked if you mind sharing the name of the agency that you work with on the PSA placements.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to give them more work. It is called the Causeway Agency, and they are based in Connecticut. Causeway, all one word.
And I will put that in our email as well. Here at Prosper, we do not do the actual PSA placement, but we do consult on plan for PSA placement and on how to make the ask. So it's something if you want to talk to us about, happy to have the conversation as well, though Causeway is much more specialized in that area than we are. Trina asks if you can share, and if you don't know off the top of your head, don't worry, we'll put it in the email, where the research is from that you mentioned, where the focus was on saying that people want inspirational connections, sort of that more asset-based versus deficit-based approach.
Yep. So we've seen that, again, I'll direct you back to some of the materials, again, that Prosper Strategy shared. Like, so for example, the Frameworks Institute, I think, has great sort of messaging that talks about, leading from an asset-based sort of messaging strategy. We saw that, again, just reaffirmed in our own individual research that we did on our behalf. When we were even testing creative, they were more open and more engaged with more positive and aspirational messaging, and so that reaffirmed what I think we're seeing sort of trend-wise. I would say look out into the world and look at other organizations and see what is trending there in terms of how they're representing. Look for things in your same sector. And I think you're going to note, the trend now is much more towards sort of this asset-based sort of messaging and branding and marketing.
Absolutely. And I'll add, too, that we've had a ton of firsthand experience with that over the last few years of helping organizations transition from that deficit-based to assets-based approach. And there's been a lot of doubt in different levels of the organization, often in the board, about whether, will we be pulling on heartstrings? Will this really work? And in every case where we've helped an organization make that shift, we've seen, based on the goals that they wanted to or needed to measure, positive shifts. So, for instance, we just helped an organization from a fundraising perspective make the shift, and within 1 year saw donations increase by 13% when we made that shift from deficit-based to assets-based. We're hoping actually to do a study on this in 2020, so look out for that. Hopefully we can get it together and shifts organizations are seeing in awareness, engagement, fundraising, programs, other important metrics after they make that assets-based communication switch. So with that said, we just have a moment to wrap up here. Wish we could keep the conversation going. Steve, thank you so much. This has been so insightful and inspiring. I hope everyone is leaving today's webinar feeling as fired up as I am about what's possible in 2020 and what our organizations can accomplish with a focus on making marketing and communications the true mission drivers that they're made to be. So if you want to keep the discussion going, you can join our private Facebook group, the Nonprofit Marketing Collaborative. You'll see a link in the chat box and on your screen. Really want to thank all of our webinar guests over the course of the last 12 months. We've had 13 webinars in the last 12 months, and want to thank all of you who have attended any one of those webinars, this one or all of them in the series or anything in between. You can go back and watch the entire archive of webinars on our site at prosper-strategies/webinars. if you need to catch up. And as you do, I hope that you all begin to feel better equipped to make marketing that driver of mission in 2020 and beyond. Truly cannot wait to hear what amazing things you accomplish as you do that. And although this series is coming to an end, do not worry, we will be back with more webinars. Our 2020 webinar schedule with a whole new list of topics and awesome guests like Steve will be announced on January 6th by email. So stay tuned for that, and you can always check out what's coming up at prosper-strategies/webinars for updates. If you'd like to be a guest on a future webinar, we are accepting inquiries for future guests, so reach out to me. My email address is on the screen. You can see our URL here, or if you just want to keep in touch, here's where to find me. And I'll close out as we opened the year with our very first webinar by saying, here's to your marketing revolution. Cannot wait to see what you accomplish. Thank you again, Steve, and thank you again to all of our guests. Have a great holiday season, everyone, and a fantastic start to 2020. Talk to you next time.